Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle. And today, I have a question for you. How do you feel about trains? You know, trains. The big, loud, boxy dudes go on tracks, take things and people from place to place, overland, all that. Well, if you're an American like me, you probably hate trains because they're communist and they're evil and they get in the way of all those beautiful, beautiful highways and parking lots that everybody just so loves. But if you're a normal, well-adjusted, non-American person, then you're probably quite fond of trains. And you know who's really fond of trains? You guessed it, Russia. In particular, this would be the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is what we're going to be talking about today. The Trans-Siberian Railroad is a bit of a weird one for me, because, well, I don't actually know a lot about it at a grand scale, but I am actually decently familiar with it at a kind of personal level. When I say decently familiar, I mean I rode on it once from Krasnoyarsk to Irkutsk, on a 24-hour train ride in a third-class cabin, with me, my 3 traveling companions, and like our 50 closest friends. But anyhow, it is something I've always kind of known about, but not like any of the details. So, on the one hand, you'd better believe I took my opportunity to ride the Russian rails when I got the chance. And also, you'd better believe me, I'm going to use my podcasting powers to learn a little bit more about this, well, big ol' railroad. So, let's get down to brass tacks. Or, really, more like steel spikes. To understand the railroad, we must first understand Siberia. Or, well, at least get kind of a glancing broad overview of the place. I want to do a whole series on the Russian invasion and colonization of Siberia, and I promise you, I will. But for now, we really just need to talk about some kind of broad stuff to set the scene for this here railroad. So, Russia officially begins its invasion and conquest of Siberia in the year 1581. This happens when the Cossack hetman Yermak Timofeyevich led some dudes across the Ural Mountains into Asia and won a battle against the forces of the Khanate of Siberia. From that point on, Russian forces would pretty much just keep slurping up more and more parts of Siberia until they got to the Pacific Ocean. And fun fact, if you think that stopped them, you would be wrong. The Russians then crossed the Bering Strait, went into Alaska, and then down the Canadian and American western coasts. Russia got as far as California. And this is as late as the mid-1800s. So, yeah, seemingly nothing was able to stop these guys. No, anyhow, many people will call this the quote-unquote Russian discovery of Siberia. This would include the Library of Congress article that I got this info from. This, of course, is some serious stinking bullshit. For one, the Russians didn't discover the place. This seems pretty clear considering the Khanate of Siberia was there first and the Russians had to go there to fight them. And two, even the Russians did discover it, this could not have been the first time the Russians had been to Siberia, not even close. First off, Siberia borders Russia, or what at the time would have been Muscovy, but fuck it, whatever. It's not hard to get there, and sure, you gotta go over the Urals, but fucking Yermak did that shit and still fought and won a battle afterward, so I guess it couldn't have been that hard. And it's not like they're a fucking mile-high brick wall, right in the middle of the Urals, so it's not, I guess, really that hard to just walk your happy ass over there. And second off, they were already beefing with the Khanate of Siberia. Clearly someone at some point had been there at some point earlier. So fuck that discovery shit. No way in hell. The way I like to think of it is that in 1581, Russia began colonizing Siberia. And as I said, they got the whole thing, from the Urals to the Pacific. So now, we need to talk about what that means. Because unless you have a map in front of you, which I kind of maybe recommend that you do, it's kind of hard to understand just how damn big Siberia truly is. So, let's get some numbers on the board. Siberia is generally considered to be the territory that is today Asian Russia, contained lengthwise by the Ural Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, and contained top to bottom by the Arctic Sea at the top, and at the bottom, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China, and just a little smidge of North Korea. Within these bounds, Siberia is roughly 5,200,000 square miles. To just understand how big that is, let's do some comparisons. The United States of America, the fourth largest country in the world, is about 3,800,000 square miles, or 1.4 million square miles smaller than Siberia. The continent of Europe is about 4 million square miles, also known as 1.2 million square miles less than Siberia. The continent of Asia, the largest continent on Earth, which contains all of Siberia, China, India, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, the entire Middle East, and so on, is a whopping 17 million square miles. So finally, there you go, something bigger than Siberia. But this means that Siberia makes up just under a third of the entire continent of Asia. And lastly, Siberia makes up 5.2 million of the 6.6 million square miles of the Russian Federation. In layman's terms, this place is pretty fucking huge. In the modern day, Siberia is basically impossible to get around over land or via river. Even to fly is kind of harder than you think. On the one hand, the weather in Siberia is harsh and can be incredibly unpredictable. On the other hand, Siberia is unbroken wilderness. And on the third hand, it's larger than the continent of Europe. This place is huge. To kind of put a little bit of this into perspective, how about an example? In 2018, I flew from Dallas, Texas to London, the United Kingdom. This took about 9 hours. Later, I flew from London to St. Petersburg. This took about 4 hours. Later in that year, I flew from Irkutsk in Siberia back to St. Petersburg. This took about 8 hours. So there you go. Dallas to London, 9 hours. Irkutsk to St. Petersburg, 8. Flying through Siberia is pretty much flying internationally. And if you don't already have a map on hand, you should get one. Because the thing about Irkutsk is that it isn't all the way across Siberia. Not even close. Irkutsk, just kind of by ogling the map, is only about halfway across Siberia. The plane flight from Irkutsk to Vladivostok, the largest city in the Russian Far East, would be another 4 hours. So, as I was saying, it's fucking hard to get around this place. And it's 2024. And as far as the, Trans-Siberian Railroad goes, we ain't talking 2024. Nah, not even close. Because to understand where this railroad comes from, we gotta kick it back even farther. So for right now, we're going to be talking about the 16 and 1700s. And at this time, Russia was really starting to see some of the benefits of this giant swath of land that they were almost done colonizing. Was it the vast resources? I mean, kinda, yeah. Furs are nice, but that ain't it. Was it the expansion of serfdom? Well, I guess. That is cool, but serfdom never really caught on in Siberia the way it did in Europe. Was it the taxable and draftable natives of Siberia? Oh boy, you betcha. That right there is the good stuff. But that's not really what I'm talking about either. Rather, we're talking about tea. You see, tea is a super popular thing in Russia. It is now, and it was then. And this is not a new thing, even in the 16 and 1700s. Tea has for a very long time been something that has connected Russia to the rest of Asia. But the one problem is that China's really far away, and there used to be all these khanates who were not really always friendly sitting in between China and Russia. But as of now, that being the 1700s, this isn't so much a problem anymore. Now, tea can be moved through Siberia, straight to Russian markets with very little problem. This was facilitated by the establishment of a border trading post in 1727. This would be the town of Kyakhta. As time went on, the Russian thirst for tea only became greater and greater, and more Russian agents flowed in, and these agents went further and further into China to acquire more and more tea. Ultimately, in the 1800s, Russia would consume anywhere from 50 to 60% of all of China's annual tea export. But oddly enough, this was not really something that spurred a lot of development in the area. It was something that created quite a bit of interest in Siberia, but only for certain people. You didn't necessarily need a lot of stuff to get that tea back to Russia. It was, I guess, easy enough. Most of these Russians would just take the tea and walk it home. Though this trade was large, it wasn't really enough to get the Russian government or even private investors interested in investing, say large projects in Siberia to facilitate this trade. At the same time as the tea trade, the Russian government took a fairly hands-off approach to Siberia. For the most part, they just pressed the locals for taxes and for their draft-age children. Otherwise, most Russian involvement was through fur trapping, which, much like tea, was a very large industry but wasn't really kind of large enough for the government to really see it as important enough to invest time, energy, and money into large-scale infrastructure in the region. And kind of like the tea trade, it didn't necessarily need a whole lot of it, Fur trappers are guys going out into the woods. They're not really building really big cities and camps and stuff to do this. Kind of like the tea traders who are just going to Kyakhta, picking up the tea, and coming back. So for pretty much all of the 1700s, Siberia was kind of just left alone by the government outside of said taxation and drafting. Which is not to say that the government was nice to the people there. Oh no. The Russian government was brutal to the people of Siberia and milked them for everything they were worth, and not infrequently would employ very serious force to get whatever they wanted. But, as I was saying before, broadly speaking, the Russian government had very little interest in doing anything in Siberia at this time. What the Russian government was doing at the time was sending prisoners to Siberia as a form of internal exile. While the Russian government did not really want to expend large amounts of official manpower or money in Siberia, they did see all the wealth and natural resources that were in Siberia. Particularly, these were mineral wealth such as coal and iron and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of trees. But Siberia was, and is, a very hard place to get to and a very difficult place to live and work in. So they started shipping off people that they didn't really care about. These prisoners were not exactly folks they cared if they came back, they mostly just cared if they produced. During the 17 and 1800s, it became quite common for people to be given long labor sentences in Siberia as an alternative to harsh punishment such as, say, execution. These folks mostly worked in cutting down trees or mining iron and coal. And then they struck gold. No, literally. There was in fact gold in them hills. By 1850, some 60,000 gold miners were in Siberia trying to make it rich. Though many of these people were likely serfs, and rather than them getting rich, they would be making their landlords rich as they sent money back as part of their labor agreement. Anyhow, this did create interest in Siberia, but not enough to really get much of anything off the ground. But then things started to shift. In the 1870s and the 1880s, Russians started moving into Siberia in large numbers. In particular, these folks were moving to southern Siberia near the border with Kazakhstan, because it was warmer there and a little bit more suitable to farming. But a lot of these folks were ex-serfs who were striking it out on their own. But even though not legally tied to the land as serfs anymore, these people weren't really supposed to just be picking up and moving around like that. Generally, the Russian government had rules about peasants moving. These rules included a law that peasants could not move without first paying off all their debts to the state. This generally locked a lot of people in place. But a lot of now free peasants seemingly didn't give a flying fuck about what the government said, and they illegally relocated anyways. And as it turns out, the Russian government didn't really care about it either. You see, the mid to late 1800s saw Russia expanding its influence into Asia in such places as China and Afghanistan. And as Russia expanded its influence into these areas, they started to bump into other people who wanted to, fuck around in those neighborhoods too. Chiefly, these would be the British in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Japan in Eastern Asia, Manchuria, northern China. And in order to compete with these dudes, Russia was going to need a large, modern military that it could quickly deploy, reinforce, and supply out in Siberia. Well, Russia already had a large military, but the Russian military needed to be modernized. And to modernize the army, they would need to make huge quantities of rifles, cannons, machine guns, bullets, and all the crates and wagons and whatnot that they would need to be transported in. And it just so happens that in the late 19th century, a number of Russian government geological surveys found that Siberia has a ton of mineral wealth. Of particular importance, coal and iron. And of course, there are trees as far as the eye can see. These coal, iron, and lumber resources are just sitting there waiting to be turned into weapons for this fancy, modernized army. Or sold for a tidy profit, of course. But they're so far away out there in Siberia, and while there is a lot of people moving to Siberia, and they are starting to build infrastructure, and this infrastructure is oftentimes mostly focused around resource exploitation and, say, manufacture, there's still not that many of them out there. So, what are we gonna do? Oh, if only there was some kind of way to quickly move people over land to set up these industries, and some way to get the raw materials back to European Russia for processing. Oh, and while we're on the subject, it'd be really nice if we could get all those soldiers out to the east quickly, because walking there or sailing there, God, it just takes forever. Oh well, I don't know. Maybe this was all just a little bit too much to ask for. If only there was some kind of road they could use. Some kind of road that goes all the way from Europe to Asia. Some kind of road you could send big supply trains across. Oh wait. And there you have it. There it is! The reason the Russian Empire wants to create a railroad in Siberia. And when might this be, you ask? 1891. Construction on the Trans-Siberian Railroad starts in 1891. February of 1891 to be exact. The goal of the Trans-Siberian Railroad was to connect European Russia to the warm water port of Vladivostok, the largest city in far eastern Siberia, via a means of travel that would take less time than shipping something over the ocean. This would allow soldiers and laborers to be sent eastward to protect Russian interests and to extract resources. And on the way back, trains would be full of raw materials needing to be processed, or, in a war, wounded soldiers in need of medical attention. So, 1891, construction begins. Construction begins in two places. Much like the American Transcontinental Railroad, the Trans-Siberian Railroad would be started at its beginning point, the Ural town of Chelyabinsk, and at its end point, the far east port city of Vladivostok, and then these two would work towards each other and meet in the middle, thus connecting European Russia to the farthest eastern reaches of the Russian Empire. And as you might imagine, this would be no simple task. Outside of just the scale of it, the Trans-Siberian Railroad had three major obstacles that it would need to overcome. One, Siberia is not just large, but it's pretty desolate. What this means is that there aren't a lot of locals to help on the project, and these locals didn't have a lot of supplies to offer up. So people and materiel for the project would have to be shipped from somewhere else. Two, the weather in Siberia is nothing short of brutal. The harsh Siberian winter brought short days, long nights, minus 30-degree weather, many feet of snow, and blizzards strong enough to knock over trees. And because it's so far north, Siberian summers tend to be short. And three, Lake Baikal. Lake Baikal, which we have discussed before, so go back and listen to the Lake Baikal episode if you want to learn more about the lake, is one of the largest lakes on the planet, and it sits right in the middle of Siberia, so it's right in the way of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. This posed a pretty serious issue because, well, the lake's huge, so what do? Do you try to build some kind of giant bridge that goes across the lake? Do you try to build around the lake, thus adding a pretty large amount of track to this already massive railroad? Or do you try to set up a ferry system? Because Lake Baikal's not actually super wide. It's pretty long, kind of top to bottom, but it's not super wide. So maybe you could just, have a little ferry system. And well, actually at first, that is what you would do. That's actually how this did work at first, is instead of building a track to either somehow go across the lake or around it, they set up a ferry system where you would take the train right up to the lake, then you'd have to get off the train, get on a boat, cross the lake, and then get back on a train on the other side. For pretty obvious reasons, that did not last very long as a plan. These obstacles, along with all of the other standard non-Siberian related issues that you would expect to encounter on any large engineering or construction project, created a very difficult and complex project for the Russian government. In order to deal with these issues, Russia employed the best engineers they had on hand and then forced a ton of prisoners and soldiers to carry out the backbreaking labor of actually building the damn thing. Because you can always count on Russia to decide that forced labor is the best labor. And in spite of the huge scale of the project and the massive obstacles in its way, the main line of the Trans-Siberian Railroad was completed in 1901. I don't know about y'all, but that's pretty damn impressive. Remember, it started in 1891. 10 years seems like a pretty quick turnaround on such a difficult and large project. But, there it is. The project is, well, actually no, it's not totally complete. On paper, it did exactly what it was supposed to. You could get on a train in Moscow and take it all the way to Vladivostok, and do so much faster than if you were to sail there, or certainly if you were to walk or ride there. Due to the new jobs in Siberia in mineral and timber industries, as well as jobs generated by the railroad itself, people were moving to Siberia in record numbers. The Trans-Siberian Railroad Committee alone helped resettle some 400,000 people to Siberia between 1892 and 1904. And with this influx of people, resources were being exploited at a greater rate than ever before. But there were problems with the railroad, not the least of which being that you had to get off and back on at Lake Baikal with a little boat ride in the middle. This was a particularly big problem for freight, where having to unload everything, load it on a boat, ferried across the lake, unload it again, and then load it back on the train was a huge waste of time and slowed everything down immensely. As well, the original Trans-Siberian Railroad only had one track. So if a train was headed east, all trains headed west would have to wait in their stations until the eastbound train had passed before they could get back on track. And the train only went to Vladivostok, which is a hell of a lot closer to Manchuria than kind of where we were starting, but it's not particularly close. And Manchuria is where Russia kind of has its sights set at the time. So having to hoof it from Vladivostok all the way to Manchuria, not really kind of what we're trying to do here. These issues were pretty apparent basically immediately, and the Russian government more or less got right away to fixing some of these issues. But then there was a small little hiccup that occurred in the year 1904 that really kind of just, made all of this shit fall apart and really brought all of these faults into pretty stark relief. This little hiccup would be something that we've discussed just a smidge about in the past. That would be the Russo-Japanese War. The Russo-Japanese War basically brought Russia to its knees as the more Western European white Russia got its shit rocked by Japan, who the rest of the European world, and Russia, saw as inferior beings who were not really people. But boy howdy, did this change things. All of a sudden, a massive, powerful, and wealthy empire had been totally defeated by a supposedly racially, societally, militarily, everythingly inferior foe. This conflict kicked off when Russia began constructing a railroad track that branched off the Trans-Siberian Railroad that ran through Manchuria. This was supposed to fix the whole, railroad ends in Vladivostok problem. This would have positioned Russia to be right in the way of Japan's expansion, and would have allowed Russia to deploy soldiers overland to oppose Japanese expansion very rapidly. This overland issue being something that would later be a huge issue in the war itself, as the Russian Navy was a very important part of moving men and supplies, and then that Navy was absolutely bodied by the Japanese. The conflict pressed on every shortcoming of the railroad that I previously listed. The railroad into Manchuria was not completed, and as such, soldiers and supplies could not be deployed as rapidly as had been hoped. The Lake Baikal problem had also not been fixed yet, and the fact that the entire railroad was only one line meant that supplies and soldiers bound for the front were being bogged down by trains carrying wounded returning home for medical care. Ultimately, the war was a pretty huge fiasco for the Russian Empire and pretty much halted their Far East expansion. But for the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the war was kind of just a little road bump, and the end of the war marked a period of rapid expansion and renovation. In 1905, the same year that the war ended, the railroad was built around Lake Baikal so that you could get around the lake instead of having to go across it. Different lines were added to the railroad to better facilitate travel back and forth. That way you're not just on that one little rinky-dink line. And in 1916, the Amur Railroad, a branch of the Greater Trans-Siberian Railroad, was completed and the railroad would reach its full size. Within the Russian border, that is. The Trans-Siberian Railroad is a really neat system because it's basically a giant line of rail that little branch railroads extend from. And many of these rail branches extend into foreign countries like Mongolia, China, and even North Korea. But those branches are outside the scope of this because they're their own railroads, and while connected to the Trans-Siberian Railroad, they're not technically part of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Anyhow, the Amur Railroad is finished in 1916, and the Trans-Siberian Railroad is finally up to date and proper size. Which, if you're paying attention to the date, means that the railroad was finished right in the middle of World War I, just in time for Russia to shatter into about 1 trillion tiny little pieces as the country was gripped by revolution and civil war. Starting in 1917 and lasting until 1922, the Russian Revolution, and then Civil War, pretty much stopped all expansion of the railroad. During this time, the railroad took a serious beating, as various different groups used the railroad and fought for control. These groups would include the White Army, the Red Army, the Siberian Intervention, which was a multinational military force that would include Americans, Canadians, Japanese, and many others. And lastly, the railroad was famously used by the Czech Legion as they fled the Eastern Front the long way around. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was the lifeline that kept Siberia connected to the rest of the world and kept the people and soldiers out there supplied. It was a vital part of any military campaign in the region, as it was the only way that anyone could get anything out there. As such, it makes a ton of sense that all of these various groups were pretty interested in murdering each other over control of that railroad. Equally unsurprising was that these groups not only used the railroad, but often attacked, sabotaged, and destroyed sections of the railroad to slow down and impede their enemies. As such, when the Russian Civil War ended in 1922, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was just about shot. It would take until 1925 for the newly minted Soviet Union to completely repair the railroad. During the interwar years, the Soviet Union mostly maintained the railroad and focused expansion into neighboring countries. The Second World War was not a super strenuous time for the Trans-Siberian Railroad, as it basically was never under serious threat, as no one really got close enough to do anything to it, and the worst of the USSR's concerns were concerned in the West, and that basically posed zero threat to the railroad at any given time. After the war, the Trans-Siberian Railroad story is pretty dull, not gonna lie. It's a railroad. They don't do much. So, let's jump to today and talk a little bit about the Trans-Siberian Railroad of now. Well, first and foremost, it is still the #1 artery of trade, commerce, and travel in the region. Remember at the beginning when I talked about how big Siberia is back in the day? Yeah? Well, it certainly hasn't gotten any smaller. As of news time today, the Trans-Siberian Railroad is 5,771 miles, or 9,288 kilometers, long. It runs from Moscow through the Urals, across the taiga, around Lake Baikal, and to the port city of Vladivostok. It spans 8 time zones and takes 7 days to complete from start to finish. Some key points on the rail include Yekaterinburg, Irkutsk, Ulan-Ude, and Krasnoyarsk. All of these are fairly large cities. And speaking of cities, Siberia is a very interesting place, and its population and settlement patterns are very much so influenced by the railroad itself. The vast majority of Siberia is very sparsely populated. A large percentage of the roughly 40 million inhabitants of Siberia live in large cities that are pretty damn big by any way of thinking about it. For example, here are some of the biggest cities in Siberia. First, we have Irkutsk and Vladivostok. These cities have about 600,000 residents. For comparison, that means these cities would just be on the outside of the top 25 largest cities in the USA. By population, they are larger than Portland, Baltimore, and OKC. Then we have Krasnoyarsk. Krasnoyarsk has a population of 1.2 million. This would make it the 10th largest city in America, which means it would be larger than San Francisco, DC, or Las Vegas. And lastly, we have Novosibirsk, the largest city in Siberia. Novosibirsk has a population of 1.6 million people. This would make it the 6th largest city in America. It is larger than Philadelphia, Dallas, San Jose, and San Antonio. And the impressive size of these cities is almost entirely because of their locations along the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Now, just about all of these were founded before the railroad, except Novosibirsk, which was founded in 1893. But people moving into these cities to work on or for the railroad, or in one of the many industries supported by the railroad, is what really drove their populations up so high. And today, the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the Siberian economy are much the same as they were back then. Things like coal, iron, and lumber are extracted out of the east and sent westward to be processed. All the while, people ride the rails to get from town to town, since any other form of overland travel is just so difficult and potentially dangerous. And now, in today's program, we're going to talk a little bit about what it is actually like to ride the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Fortunately, I've had the pleasure of riding the Russian rails. In the spring of 2018, the same trip where I went to Lake Baikal, I took the train from Krasnoyarsk to Irkutsk. On the Trans-Siberian Railroad, there are 3 ways of traveling. You have first class, in which you have your own private cabin, second class, in which you share a cabin with whoever else just so happens to have a second class ticket, and Platzkart. And let me tell you, Platzkart is the way to go. Platzkart is basically a big communal train car where like you and your, 50 closest friends are all sharing a big metal tube with benches to sleep on. The setup of Platzkart is that on the right-hand side, if you're coming from the front of the car, you have these benches parallel to the walkway running along the wall. These are then divided by a little wall every 6 or 7 feet or so. On the left, you have these little cutouts with 4 benches running perpendicular to the walkway. There are 2 benches on either side, and they are stacked one on top of the other with a communal table in the center. These benches double as where you sit on the train and where you sleep at night. Aside from the walls that make up these little cutouts and a curtain you can pull in front of your individual bench, there is no separation from anyone else. It's truly a hell of an experience. It's certainly not for everyone, as it is kind of like riding a public bus that you can also sleep on, but it is a really neat experience as you get to really know the people around you. For example, I met a man who was a professional comedian who would go from town to town riding the rails to go perform at weddings and other functions like that. Along with him was his cameraman. And the only thing I ever saw the two of them take out or use was a half-gallon jug of apple juice and one of those 100-count cigarette cartons. It was a trip, man. But honestly, other than the joys of Platzkart, the train itself is pretty much just that. It seemed nice enough, and, well, it got me where I was going, and it does the same for what must be millions of annual riders. It's a really neat thing, and if and when Russia is once again not so totally unsafe for Americans and Western Europeans to visit, I would highly recommend taking a ride if you ever have the chance. But with that, I think it's about time to wrap this guy up. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you learned a thing or two about the Trans-Siberian Railroad. If you did enjoy, or even if you didn't, please don't hesitate to leave me a review on whatever platform it is that you're listening on, as your input helps me make the show better, and of course, engagement with the show does make the algorithm happy, and it brings new people to the show. If you are interested in staying up to date with the show, you can follow it at BTRSPod on Instagram. But for now, thank you all again for listening. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.